I've been at it most of the week. I got deep into this wiring harness for the ECU, and I go to bed at night and I'd wake up the next morning and I'd forget a couple of things I'd figured out, couldn't remember how I was going to solve them. And so I realized that if I tried to work on it only on the weekends, it would take me months because I'd spend the first half of every day trying to remember what I was doing. So I've taken a lot of time off this week and really been at the wiring. I think the last video I made, we got in the passenger side of the motor and I was working on the driver's side of the motor. This one took a lot longer because a lot of the stuff that's been deleted by the previous owner, emission stuff you don't need, was on this side, so it took a long time to sort all that out, delete wires. There's TGVs. I don't even know what that stands for, but they're right here under the intake, between the intake and the combustion chambers there. There are valves that open and close. It's supposed to help with cold startups and emissions. I don't have cold startups. It never gets below 45 degrees here, so I'm not too concerned about that. Supposedly they cost a lot of horsepower. Previous owner had already ripped them out. I'm certainly not putting them back. And then there was a secondary air system that basically pumped extra air into the motor, trying to capture non-combusted fuels. He'd already deleted it. Most people delete it on a Subaru, who drive a Subaru, much less when they put it in an 818. So all that had been deleted out, and I had to figure out what to do with the wiring. The only thing I don't have solved yet is right here. This is what went to the secondary air system, which is mostly fine. Delete it. You don't want most of it. However, that's where the atmospheric pressure sensor was, and it's mounted to one of the valves, and it looks like the previous owner threw it away. So you can't buy just a pressure transmitter. You got to buy a whole new valve, which is pretty expensive. So I'm trying to figure out what I can do. I bought a cheap valve, or a cheap map sensor for a Chevy. We're going to see if I can make that work. If not, then maybe I can just stick a resistor in there and get the right resistance for whatever atmospheric would be, since I live at sea level. So I got all of this buttoned up, except for that one wire that needs to be tucked in there. And so I got all the motor buttoned up, and then started trying to figure out where everything else on the engine went, and that's basically what I did. Any wire that wasn't hooked to something in the motor, I traced it down, figured out what it was, whether I needed it, didn't need it. And so that led me into another rabbit hole. Those two wires tucked right there go to the immobilizer, and so that might have put that immobilizer might have put a big kink in all my plans. The immobilizer unit, which I still have, it's over there in that wad of wires, is married to the ECU by some encrypted VIN number, and the immobilizer unit, and the key, and the key antenna. Oh, there's the key. The key's got an RFID chip in it, apparently. And then the lock right there actually has an antenna in it that picks up the RFID signal, transmits it to the immobilizer. And best I can tell, it goes through the gauge cluster as well. So the gauge cluster is married. So I spent a lot of time actually doing a little research, trying to figure out how I can get rid of the immobilizer. And best I can tell so far, you can't. None of the tuners enable you to disable the check in the ECU. And what the immobilizer does, it doesn't just prevent the stop. It actually, if the ECU doesn't get a good signal from the immobilizer, it shuts off the fuel injectors. So without changing my ECU to an aftermarket ECU or an older Subaru ECU that didn't have an immobilizer, I can't get rid of the immobilizer. I'm okay keeping the immobilizer. It's not a big deal. I don't mind keeping the factory key, but I didn't want to keep the factory dash. I really wanted to use a tablet for the dash. And there just doesn't appear to be enough research, or at least people who have published their research, for me to know if I really need the gauge cluster or if I can get by with just the key, the immobilizer, and the ECU. So I'm going to have to do some testing with that. So these are all the wires that go from the ECU up to the gauge cluster. The one that I want to delete, I put in weather pack quick disconnects so that if I do figure out how to get rid of the gauge cluster and not have it affect the immobilizer, I'll be able to just unplug it and get it out. All those come up here, so I got to get the gauge cluster out of storage and start wiring that up. Brake lights, clutch switch got wired up. I am not using the full Subaru unit. I'm using the Coach 1 wiring harness. And the Coach 1 wiring harness is negative triggered for a lot of things. So like the Subaru ECU is expecting 12 volts from the brake pedal to the ECU, but the Coach is expecting a ground signal from the brake pedal, and then it triggers the brake outputs. It reduces a lot of hot wires running around the cabin, so I like that about the Coach system. So I had to figure out what to do there. I basically set the brake pedal up for negative ground, sent it back to the Coach, and then sent the brake signal that goes out to the tail lights. I also sent that over to the ECU, so the ECU gets a hot signal for the brakes. The ECU controls the cruise control. So yeah, that's basically a whole week, at least 40 hours. I've been working more than 8 hours a day on it. But the ECU is mounted in its permanent location. Every wire on it is either hooked up where it needs to go or deleted, with the exception of the stuff that goes to HVAC, because I don't have my HVAC system yet. Not too sure exactly how it's going to control because I haven't picked a brand. I'm still debating that. So the HVAC stuff's cooled up. But everything that goes to the steering column, the gauges, and the motor is ran. I still have to hook up, obviously, the gauges because I don't have the gauge cluster here. I also went ahead and hooked up some of the wires that I'd ran earlier, like all the wires to the front for the lights and the radiator. I went ahead and terminated that on the Coach harness. So tomorrow I need to run a wire from the Coach to the starter solenoid, and then I got to get the key and ignition. Right now no power here, so I got to get the ignition key wired up so that I can then turn the power on and off, and I'll be able to start testing electronics. So the other thing I have to do is run power around the engine bay. So I did not run the power in the harness with all the signal wires. I'm going to run a second harness, a small one, around the engine bay that's got power that daisy chains to all the things that need power, which isn't a lot. Mass airflow sensor needs power. The oxygen sensor needs power. And then the throttle, actually the throttle body gets its power out of the ECU, so that doesn't. Something over there needs power as well. I'm not too sure what it is. Possibly I'm running power over there for the air pumps that aren't there anymore, but there's a wire there that requests power, so I'm going to go ahead and run it. Also, the neutral switch on the back of the transmission needs power, so that the engine will know when I'm in neutral. I won't hook up a neutral safety switch or a clutch safety switch. Several occasions on my other car I've needed to crank it in gear to jump start it, so not going to hook that up. I'll just be careful and make sure I don't roll it over while I'm in gear unless I mean to. So I'm gonna put up for the day. My pack is killing me from being hunched over inside this little cabin all day long, and get back on it tomorrow.